Hi, Chris here, and I am going to be talking a little bit more about the Paradise Square project, for which I began this series of production journals. It is going to be a standalone graphic novel, that is, if it gets published, and it revolves around a gang of kids in the 1850s, 60s, 70s called the Baxter Street Dudes. Historically, this gang was in the 1870s, but there are a lot of things about the 1850s in this particular neighborhood that I like, both aesthetically and in terms of just what I want to include. So I may age them, or I may spike them down a little bit, about 15 years, which I don't think is necessarily a problem. If I treat this project the way that I want to treat this project, which is more approaching it with the idea that sort of the Asbury Gangs of New York is in itself a genre, and just a genre that has not been properly exploited. The same way that you might, do a Western featuring, Wild Bill Hickok or somebody in that vein, but skew the aesthetics of that a little bit later to where you have, wider brim hats and holsters that hang low and things along those lines. It deviates to some degree from the way that I usually like to approach historical stuff, but again, I'm wanting to think of this more as a genre piece that happens to be historical than a historical piece in and of itself. So what I've done over the past few weeks is work on my outline, and I have gotten to the point that I'm actually very happy with it. What I usually do is try and fail to write the first act multiple times, giving a few days or a couple weeks in between each one. And eventually all of the different components that I want to be in there percolate in my head, simmer a little bit, kind of like a, something on the stove, and eventually a soup comes out that is the actual story. As long as I'm not trying to force it, I'll eventually sit down, and one of the attempts that I have to try and write the first act will be successful and will lead to the outlining of the entirety of the story, which is what happened in this case. And the key component that made it possible is that I figured out who my villain is. Now, initially I thought that my antagonist would be an actor named Shanfrau, who played the character Mose in the Bowery Theater for a number of years. And it is this character that the Baxter Street Dudes will use as the subject of the play that they're going to be putting on. And initially I was thinking that Shanfrau would not be so much a villain as he would be an antagonist. His purposes would be at odds with that of the dudes, and being unable to come to an agreement philosophically, they would end up opposing each other, and it would, would lead to conflict both from a philosophical standpoint and also physically. But I didn't really like that, because one of the things that's really important when you're dealing with characters who are in themselves undertaking illegal acts as a norm, whatever those might be, this is the case with pirates, it's the case with Robin Hood stuff, bandits, whatever. If you're wanting your audience to empathize and associate with these characters and get behind them. Sometimes mobster movies, you don't necessarily want that. You're viewing it from the outside as a tragedy. But in this instance, I want the readers to be on the side of these kids. You're in a difficult position because your characters are doing things that are, by our social and moral laws, wrong. They're stealing, they're conning, whatever it might be. So in order to make that work, you have to have a couple of things, a couple of components that I think the world of this story will permit. One of which is to deal with the fact that the social institution um, and the status quo in which these kids live is in itself evil or corrupt. And that is not difficult to do in this era because you've got the whole town, or at the very least the Sixth Ward in which this is taking place, under the thumb of a variety of ward bosses and political gangs and political bosses who are operating to some degree for the welfare of their constituents, but mostly for their own self-interest. And when they are operating for their constituents, they are doing so in a way that furthers those self-interests. The Tammany Hall Democratic Party of New York in the 1850s, 1860s is one of America's most corrupt political institutions that we've ever had. And so this already works to some degree that this is there. There's nobody looking out for these kids. The municipal authorities are all sort of in it for themselves, and so you've got this social structure that's already problematic at best and dangerous and morally unscrupulous at worst. And so you've got that. The other thing that's really helpful in order to establish lawbreaker characters as good is to have them at odds with someone who is worse. And this can usually go in one of two instances. One, you have another lawbreaker who is worse. That your heroes adhere to some sort of guiding moral principle. That, yeah, they're crooks, but they're crooks with a code. A lot of pirate stories fall into this. A lot of mobster stories fall into this. And you've got a crook without a code, and the conflict between the two is difficult. What's even more potentially successful, I think, is when you have a representative of a failed system of law and order. Who is the antagonist and showcases the corruption or evil inherent in the system that these protagonists are bucking against. And so initially I was thinking that this, and that's what I found in a historical figure, and I was very excited to find this because when I found it, everything came together. So initially I was thinking that Shanfrau, the actor who played Mose, would be the antagonist. But what I found was that he did not write most of the Mose plays, which I thought that he did. The person who wrote them was a guy named E.Z.C. Judson, who is better known to history through his nom de plume, Ned Buntline. He was a playwright in the Bowery. He was also a prolific dime novelist. And played no small part in mythologizing the Wild West, writing about Wild Bill Hickok and Wyatt Earp. If you are a Western enthusiast or a firearms enthusiast, you probably heard of the Buntline Specials. These are guns that he had made and commissioned and given to a variety of famous Western lawmen and people like that. Like Wyatt Earp had one. They had these, huge barrels. But in addition to this, he was also a ward boss and leg breaker for the Democratic Party under Captain Isaiah Riders or Renders. I always forget whether or not there's an N in there. He took place in the Astor Place riot. And just across the board was a pretty reprehensible human being. I'm reading a biography about him called The Great Rascal right now, and basically the type of guy that if you're looking for a historical figure who is going to have no qualms about roughing up children, Ned Buntline is it. And so it works out really well in that he is both attached to this character and claims ownership of this character that these kids want to exploit narratively, and also would be the person who would go after them if they started amping up their illegal dealings without running it by and giving a cut to Tammany. And so both of the things that I wanted them to have to deal with can come to a head against this one figure. And so that's really, really exciting to me. So I've got the outline done now because the villain was sort of the missing piece of the puzzle. And once I had him, it all came together really easily. And so I put it together, I wrote it up, and I sent it to my agent, Charlie. And Charlie sent back a couple of notes. The first of which is that I had presented it like an ensemble. And I've done the last 3 books that I've done have been ensemble books. It's been the Creep series. And he pointed out that with a standalone especially, it's very difficult to get your audience fully engaged with an ensemble cast rather than to offer them a lead character, possibly with supporting characters who have just as much page time, but a character who can serve as our protagonist and whose journey is clear throughout the course of the book. And so I had one in mind. It's the leader of this group, a kid named Babyface Willie. I didn't make it up. It's what his actual name was, although I'm entirely fictionalizing the character because as far as I've been able to find, there's very little about him save for his identity as the leader of this particular gang. And the other thing that he pointed out is that I had given him some physical obstacles that I thought would work well within the context of the ensemble. But he pointed out that as a protagonist, making him, at the very least, physically hyper-competent could allow for greater immersion on the part of younger readers. Because, and he asked me, you know, what types of books, what types of stories I liked when I was younger. And as a rule, they tended to be ones with characters who were capable of doing things that I was not. You know, Sherlock Holmes is a better detective. Zorro is a better swashbuckler. You know, Indiana Jones has tenacity and at very least a grasp of languages, even if he's not. He stumbles through everything, but he still gets through everything. And Charlie mentioned Delilah Dirk as a good contemporary example. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And it forced me to relook at to re-examine the story in the way that I wanted to tell it. And I think that what would probably better serve is to have a character who is physically hyper-competent. And to pick another example from the same era, Jack Kelly from Newsies, the Christian Bale character, might be a good example of a character who seems to have it all together, but actually has a lot of social deficiencies, and that's what he might need to overcome. And in this instance, I think that the primary difficulty that this character will deal with, and it's also one of the things that will make him, I hope, compelling as a main character, is that he has no sense of consequence. That the actions that he undertakes increasingly put himself and those he cares about at risk. But for principle or for drive, he is unable to accept that risk is real. And I think that through that, you're going to find some internal conflict that'll be really fun to examine. So those are the two aspects that Charlie asked me to bring to the forefront, and I decided that I agree with him, and I'm going to do that. So now I've got an outline that I'm happy with, and it doesn't plot-wise change the structure at all. It just changes how I choose to present the outline. So I feel good about where the plot is, where the outline is. All that is left at this point is to put together sample pages. So that is where I am now, and I tried thumbnailing the opening pages of the book because I thought, well, I know what I want it to be, and that'll be good. And I was having no end of difficulty doing so because I felt like nothing I was doing was successfully conveying the spirit of what I wanted the book to be. And it wasn't until I was really trying to figure out sample pages that could be exciting, that I hit on something that I am still wrestling with whether or not I want to use it, but I think I might. And that is to approach the comic from a much more formal standpoint than I usually approach comics with. Most of the time, the degree of formalism that I affix to any given project begins and ends with the mechanics of the page, and the only time I get really playful with it is in word balloons and sound effects. And other than that, I tend to approach it very straightforward and from an objective standpoint narrative. I don't have narration captions. I don't have page design that isn't just a series of panels. I treat them, that they operate the same way that a movie would operate, in the sense that you are observing the action, and that's the extent of it. What I think might be more fun with this particular project, and it's definitely going to put me far out of my comfort zone, which is good because I feel like any project that I undertake needs to have some aspect of it that, dangles me well over the precipice of failure. Just because otherwise, how am I going to grow as a storyteller, as an artist? And in this instance, I think it's going to be that the book is going to be diagram heavy and map heavy and things along those lines. Because so much of it is going to involve both scams and techniques for robbery and things like that, but also on the theatrical side, how they're going to undertake special effects and things along those lines. And all of these, when one is trying to play them out narratively and see what's happening, would drastically add to the page count to try and go through all of these things. But if you're showing a manner by which to pick somebody's pocket or to open a warehouse window, and you do it in a series of, a 4-panel diagram, that can potentially propel the narrative along at a much more rapid pace than I was intending, and also give a better sense of the day-to-day workings of this kind of thing, that these are things that the characters do and have names for and understand. This is a particular type of con. This is a particular type of grab. And so, Babyface Willie can say, oh, do the, throw a ruby sand, and there will be a thing explaining what a ruby sand is. I don't know what a ruby sand is. I just made up the term, but it sounded period. Same for the special effects for the shows. One thing that's kind of fun, the more that I read about the types of shows that were being undertaken at this period, is that the more parallels between these kids putting on a theatrical production and modern kids potentially making a horror movie in their backyard they're strikingly similar in both the approach and, to no small degree, the content. The sort of DIY special effects that would be undertaken in these theatrical productions parallel what might happen if somebody's trying to make a zombie movie, with their friends. And I think that seeing those parallels and trying to draw those out are going to allow contemporary readers to feel a kinship with these characters based on shared experience, because a lot of people have done that kind of thing where they're trying to put together some sort of narrative with their peers or with their friends or something along those lines. Or at least a lot of the people that I know do that, because we all grew up to be comic artists. So in any case, I think that showing how to make how they would make a character that has a head that explodes when Lil Mo punches it, over the audience and the audience screams. Those will also be employed, as well as maps of, the 5 points, or in maps of, the Tammany Hall basement, or things along those lines, and how these play into the narrative with little things around them. This is not something I've ever done, and it's not something for which I feel like I have a natural inclination, but I am excited that that might potentially be an intrinsic part of the way that the story is told. And so that's going to be my next step, is putting together some sample pages that showcase this approach to storytelling, that it will be a mix of straight narrative, but also these kind of map things. So that's going to be fun, and that's about where I am on it. So I'm going to be tackling those over the next couple of weeks and sending those to my agent. He's going to be helping me craft a pitch for the publisher, and we're going to put that together, and I'll show the sample pages and some of the other stuff. So